Chapter 22 of Sylvie and Bruno Concluded by Lewis Carroll. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Catharine Eastman. Chapter 22. The Banquet. Heaviness may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. The next day found me quite another being. Even the memories of my lost friend and companion were sunny as the genial weather that smiled around me. I did not venture to trouble Lady Muriel or her father with another call so soon, but took a walk into the country, and only turned homewards when the low sunbeams warned me that day would soon be over. On my way home, I passed the cottage where the old man lived, whose face always recalled to me the day when I first met Lady Muriel, and I glanced in as I passed, half curious to see if he were still living there. Yes, the old man was still alive. He was sitting out in the porch, looking just as he did when I first saw him at Fayfield Junction. It seemed only a few days ago. "Good evening," I said, pausing. "Good evening, Meister," he cheerfully responded. "Won't you step in?" I stepped in, and took a seat on the bench in the porch. "I'm glad to see you looking so hearty," I began. "Last time, I remember, I chanced to pass just as Lady Muriel was coming away from the house. Does she still come to see you?" "Yes," he answered slowly. "She hasna forgotten me. I don't lose her bonny face for many days together. Well I mind the very first time she come, after we'd met at the railway station. She told me as she come to make amends. Dear child, only think o' that, to make amends!" "To make amends for what?" I inquired. "What could she have done to need it?" "Well, it were like this, you see. We were both on us a-waiting for the train at the junction, and I had setten mysen down upon the bench, and station master, he comes and orders me off, for to make room for her ladyship, you understand." "I remember it all," I said. "I was there myself that day." "Was you now? Well, and she axes my pardon for't. Think o' that now. My pardon. An old ne'er-do-well like me. Ha! She's been here many a time sin' then. Why, she were in here only yestereen, as it were, a-sitting, as it might be, where you're a-sitting now, and looking sweeter and kinder nor an angel. And she says, 'You've not got your Minnie now,' she says, 'to fettle for ye.' Minnie was my granddaughter, sir, as lived with me. She died a matter of 2 months ago, or it may be 3. She was a bonny lass, and a good lass too. But life has been rare and lonely without her." He covered his face in his hands, and I waited a minute or two in silence for him to recover himself. "So she says, 'Just take me for your Minnie,' she says. 'Didna Minnie make your tea for you?' says she. 'Aye,' says I. And she makes the tea. 'And didna Minnie light your pipe?' says she. 'Aye,' says I. And she lights the pipe for me. 'And didna Minnie set out your tea into porch?' And I says, 'My dear,' I says, 'I'm thinking you're Minnie hersen.' And she cries a bit. We both on us cries a bit." Again I kept silence for a while. "And while I smokes my pipe, she sits and talks to me, as lovin' and as pleasant. I'll be bound I thought it were Minnie come again. And when she gets up to go, I says, 'Winnot she shake hands with me?' says I. And she says, 'Na,' she says, 'I cannot shake hands with thee,' she says." "I'm sorry she said that," I put in, thinking it was the only instance I had ever known of pride of rank showing itself in Lady Muriel. "Bless you, it were'na pride," said the old man, reading my thoughts. "She says, 'Your Minnie never shook hands with you,' she says, 'and I'm your Minnie now,' she says. And she just puts her dear arms about my neck, and she kisses me on the cheek, and may God in heaven bless her." And here the poor old man broke down entirely, and could say no more. "God bless her," I echoed, "and good night to you." I pressed his hand and left him. "Lady Muriel," I said softly to myself as I went homewards, "truly you know how to make amends." Seated once more by my lonely fireside, I tried to recall the strange vision of the night before, and to conjure up the face of the dear old Professor among the blazing coals. That black one, with just a touch of red, would suit him well, I thought. After such a catastrophe, it would be sure to be covered with black stains, and he would say, "The result of that combination, you may have noticed, was an explosion. Shall I repeat the experiment?" "No, no, don't trouble yourself," was the general cry. And we all trooped off in hot haste to the banqueting hall, where the feast had already begun. No time was lost in helping the dishes, and very speedily every guest found his plate filled with good things. "I have always maintained the principle," the Professor began, "that it is a good rule to take some food occasionally. The great advantage of dinner parties—" He broke off suddenly. "Why, actually, here's the other Professor!" he cried. "And there's no place left for him!" The other Professor came in reading a large book, which he held close to his eyes. One result of his not looking where he was going was that he tripped up as he crossed the saloon, flew up into the air, and fell heavily on his face in the middle of the table. "What a pity!" cried the kind-hearted Professor as he helped him up. "It wouldn't be me if I didn't trip," said the other Professor. The Professor looked much shocked. "Almost anything would be better than that!" he exclaimed. "It never does," he added, aside to Bruno, "to be anybody else, does it?" To which Bruno gravely replied, "I's got nuffin on my plate." The Professor hastily put on his spectacles, to make sure that the facts were all right to begin with. Then he turned his jolly round face upon the unfortunate owner of the empty plate. "And what would you like next, my little man?"
"Well," Bruno said, a little doubtfully, "I think I'll take some plum pudding, please, while I think of it."
"Oh, Bruno!" This was a whisper from Sylvie. "It isn't good manners to ask for a dish before it comes." And Bruno whispered back,
"But I might forget to ask for some when it comes, oo know. I do forget things sometimes,"
he added, seeing Sylvie about to whisper more. And this assertion Sylvie did not venture to contradict. Meanwhile, a chair had been placed for the other Professor, between the Empress and Sylvie. Sylvie found him a rather uninteresting neighbour. In fact, she couldn't afterwards remember that he had made more than one remark to her during the whole banquet, and that was, "What a comfort a dictionary is!" She told Bruno afterwards that she had been too much afraid of him to say more than "Yes, sir," in reply, and that had been the end of their conversation. On which Bruno expressed a very decided opinion that wasn't worth calling a conversation at all.
"Oo should have asked him a riddle," he added triumphantly. "Why, I asked the Professor 3 riddles. One was that one you asked me in the morning, how many pennies is there in 2 shillings? And another was—"
"Oh, Bruno," Sylvie interrupted, "that wasn't a riddle."
"It were,"
Bruno fiercely replied. By this time, a waiter had supplied Bruno with a plateful of something, which drove the plum pudding out of his head. "Another advantage of dinner parties," the Professor cheerfully explained, for the benefit of anyone that would listen, "is that it helps you to see your friends. If you want to see a man, offer him something to eat. It's the same rule with a mouse."
"This cat's very kind to the mouses,"
Bruno said, stooping to stroke a remarkably fat specimen of the race, that had just waddled into the room, and was rubbing itself affectionately against the leg of his chair.
"Please, Sylvie, pour some milk in your saucer. Pussy's ever so thirsty."
"Why do you want my saucer?" said Sylvie. "You've got one yourself."
"Yes, I know," said Bruno. "But I wanted mine for to give it some more milk in."
Sylvie looked unconvinced. However, it seemed quite impossible for her ever to refuse what her brother asked, so she quietly filled her saucer with milk and handed it to Bruno, who got down off his chair to administer it to the cat. "The room's very hot with all this crowd," the Professor said to Sylvie. "I wonder why they don't put some lumps of ice in the grate. You fill it with lumps of coal in the winter, you know, and you sit round it and enjoy the warmth. How jolly it would be to fill it now with lumps of ice, and sit round it and enjoy the coolth." Hot as it was, Sylvie shivered a little at the idea. "It's very cold outside," she said. "My feet almost got frozen today." "That's the shoemaker's fault," the Professor cheerfully replied. "How often I've explained to him that he ought to make boots with little iron frames under the soles to hold lamps. But he never thinks. No one would suffer from cold if only they would think of those little things. I always use hot ink myself in the winter. Very few people ever think of that, yet how simple it is." "Yes, it's very simple," Sylvie said politely. "Has the cat had enough?" This was to Bruno, who had brought back the saucer only half emptied. But Bruno did not hear the question. "There's somebody scratching at the door and wanting to come in," he said, and he scrambled down off his chair and went and cautiously peeped out through the doorway. "Who was it wanted to come in?" Sylvie asked as he returned to his place. "It were a mouse," said Bruno, "and it peeped it in, and it saw the cat, and it said, 'I'll come in another day.' And I said, 'Oo needn't be frightened, the cat's welly kind to mouses.' And it said, 'But I's got some important business what I must attend to.' And it said, 'I'll call again tomorrow.' And it said, 'Give my love to the cat.'" "What a fat cat it is!" said the Lord Chancellor, leaning across the Professor to address his small neighbour. "It's quite a wonder." "It was awfully fat when it came in," said Bruno. "So it would be more wonderfuller if it got thin all in a minute." "And that was the reason, I suppose," the Lord Chancellor suggested, "why you didn't give it the rest of the milk?" "No," said Bruno, "it were a betterer reason. I tooked the saucer up 'cause it were so discontented." "It doesn't look so to me," said the Lord Chancellor. "What made you think it was discontented?" "'Cause it grumbled in its throat." "Oh, Bruno!" cried Sylvie. "Why, that's the way cats show they're pleased." Bruno looked doubtful. "It's not a good way," he objected. "Oo wouldn't say I were pleased if I made that noise in my throat." "What a singular boy!" the Lord Chancellor whispered to himself, but Bruno had caught the words. "What do it mean to say a singular boy?" he whispered to Sylvie. "It means one boy," Sylvie whispered in return. "And plural means 2 or 3. "Then I's welly glad I is a singular boy," Bruno said with great emphasis. "It would be horrid to be 2 or 3 boys. P'raps they wouldn't play with me." "Why should they?" said the other Professor, suddenly waking up out of a deep reverie. "They might be asleep, you know." "Couldn't, if I was awake," Bruno said cunningly. "Oh, but they might indeed," the other Professor protested. "Boys don't all go to sleep at once, you know. So these boys. But who are you talking about?" "He never remembers to ask that first," the Professor whispered to the children. "Why, the rest of me, of course!" Bruno exclaimed triumphantly. "Supposing I was 2 or 3 boys!" The other Professor sighed and seemed to be sinking back into his reverie, but suddenly brightened up again and addressed the Professor. "There's nothing more to be done now, is there?" "Well, there's the dinner to finish," the Professor said with a bewildered smile. "And the heat to bear. I hope you'll enjoy the dinner, such as it is. and that you won't mind the heat, such as it isn't." This sentence sounded well, but somehow I couldn't quite understand it, and the other professor seemed to be no better off. "Such as it isn't what?" he peevishly inquired. "It isn't as hot as it might be," the professor replied, catching at the first idea that came to hand. "Ah, I see what you mean now," the other professor graciously remarked. "It's very badly expressed, but I quite see it now. 13 minutes and a half ago," he went on, looking first at Bruno and then at his watch as he spoke, "you said, 'This cat's very kind to the mouses.' It must be a singular animal." "So it are," said Bruno, after carefully examining the cat, to make sure how many there were of it. "But how do you know it's kind to the mouses, or, more correctly speaking, the mice?" "'Cause it plays with the mouses," said Bruno, "for to amuse them, oo know." "But that is just what I don't know," the other professor rejoined. "My belief is, it plays with them to kill them." "Oh, that's quite a accident," Bruno began, so eagerly that it was evident he had already propounded this very difficulty to the cat. "It 'splained all that to me while it were drinking the milk. It said, 'I teaches the mouses new games. The mouses likes it ever so much.' It said, 'Sometimes little accidents happens. Sometimes the mouses kills theirselves.' It said, 'I's always welly sorry when the mouses kills theirselves.' It said—" "If it was so very sorry," Sylvie said, rather disdainfully, "it wouldn't eat the mouses after they'd killed themselves." But this difficulty also had evidently not been lost sight of in the exhaustive ethical discussion just concluded.
"It said—"
The orator constantly omitted as superfluous his own share in the dialogue, and merely gave us the replies of the cat.
"It said, 'Dead mouses never objects to be eaten.' It said, 'There's no use wasting good mouses.' It said, 'Whiffle something or other.' It said, 'And oo may live to say, how much I wish I had the mouse that then I threw away.' It said—"
"It hadn't time to say such a lot of things," Sylvie interrupted indignantly.
"Oo doesn't know how cats speaks,"
Bruno rejoined contemptuously.
"Cats speak welly quick."
End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Sylvie and Bruno Concluded by Lewis Carroll. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Catharine Eastman. Chapter 23. The Pigtail. By this time, the appetites of the guests seemed to be nearly satisfied, and even Bruno had the resolution to say, when the professor offered him a 4th slice of plum pudding,
"I thinks 3 helpings is enough."
Suddenly the professor started, as if he had been electrified. "Why, I had nearly forgotten the most important part of the entertainment. The other professor is to recite a tale of a pig. I mean a pigtail," he corrected himself. "It has introductory verses at the beginning and at the end." "It can't have introductory verses at the end, can it?" said Sylvie. "Wait till you hear it," said the professor. "Then you'll see. I'm not sure it hasn't some in the middle as well." Here he rose to his feet, and there was an instant silence through the banqueting hall. They evidently expected a speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," the professor began, "the other professor is so kind as to recite a poem. The title of it is The Pigtail. He never recited it before." General cheering among the guests. "He will never recite it again." Frantic excitement and wild cheering all down the hall, the professor himself mounting the table in hot haste to lead the cheering, and waving his spectacles in one hand and a spoon in the other. Then the other professor got up and began. Little birds are dining warily and well, hid in mossy cell. Hid, I say, by waiters, gorgeous in their gaiters. I've a tale to tell. Little birds are feeding justices with jam, rich in frizzled ham. Rich, I say, in oysters, haunting shady cloisters. That is what I am. Little birds are teaching tigresses to smile, innocent of guile. Smile, I say, not smirkle. Mouth a semicircle. That's the proper style. Little birds are sleeping all among the pins, where the loser wins, where I say he sneezes, when and how he pleases. So the tale begins. There was a pig that sat alone beside a ruined pump. By day and night he made his moan. It would have stirred a heart of stone to see him wring his hoofs and groan, because he could not jump. A certain camel heard him shout, a camel with a hump. "Oh, is it grief, or is it gout? What is this bellowing about?" That pig replied, with quivering snout, "Because I cannot jump." That camel scanned him, dreamy-eyed. "Methinks you are too plump. I never knew a pig so wide, that wobbled so from side to side, who could, however much he tried, do such a thing as jump. Yet mark those trees, 2 miles away, all clustered in a clump. If you could trot there twice a day, nor ever pause for rest or play, in the far future, who can say, you may be fit to jump." That camel paused and left him there, beside the ruined pump. Oh, horrid was that pig's despair! His shrieks of anguish filled the air. He wrung his hoofs, he rent his hair, because he could not jump. There was a frog that wandered by, a sleek and shining lump, inspected him with fishy eye, and said, "O pig, what makes you cry?" And bitter was that pig's reply, "Because I cannot jump." That frog he grinned a grin of glee, and hit his chest a thump. "O pig," he said, "be ruled by me, and you shall see what you shall see. This minute, for a trifling fee, I'll teach you how to jump. You may be faint from many a fall, and bruised by many a bump. But if you persevere through all, and practice first on something small, concluding with a 10-foot wall, you'll find that you can jump." That pig looked up with joyful start. "O frog, you are a trump! Your words have healed my inward smart. Come, name your fee and do your part. Bring comfort to a broken heart by teaching me to jump." "My fee shall be a mutton chop, my goal this ruined pump. Observe with what an airy flop I plant myself upon the top. Now bend your knees and take a hop, for that's the way to jump." Up rose that pig, and rushed full whack against the ruined pump, rolled over like an empty sack, and settled down upon his back, while all his bones at once went crack. It was a fatal jump. When the other professor had recited this verse, he went across to the fireplace and put his head up the chimney. In doing this he lost his balance, and fell head first into the empty grate, and got so firmly fixed there that it was some time before he could be dragged out again. Bruno had had time to say, "I thought he wanted to see how many peoples was up the chimbley." And Sylvie had said, "Chimney, not chimbly." And Bruno had said, "Don't talk ubbish." All this while the other professor was being extracted. "You must have blacked your face," the Empress said anxiously. "Let me send for some soap." "Thanks, no," said the other professor, keeping his face turned away. "Black's quite a respectable colour. Besides, soap would be no use without water." Keeping his back well turned away from the audience, he went on with the introductory verses. "Little birds are writing interesting books, to be read by cooks. Read, I say, not roasted.
Letterpress, when toasted, loses its good looks. Little birds are playing bagpipes on the shore, where the tourists snore. Thanks, they cry, 'tis thrilling. Take, oh take this shilling, let us have no more. Little birds are bathing crocodiles in cream, like a happy dream, like, but not so lasting. Crocodiles, when fasting, are not all they seem. That camel passed, as day grew dim, around the ruined pump. "O broken heart, O broken limb, it needs," that camel said to him, "something more fairy-like and slim to execute a jump." That pig lay still as any stone, and could not stir a stump. Nor ever, if the truth were known, was he again observed to moan, nor ever wring his hoofs and groan, because he could not jump. That frog made no remark, for he was dismal as a dump. He knew the consequence must be that he would never get his fee, and still he sits in misery upon that ruined pump. "It's a miserable story," said Bruno. "It begins miserably, and it ends miserablier. I think I shall cry. Sylvie, please lend me your handkerchief." "I haven't got it with me," Sylvie whispered. "Then I won't cry," said Bruno manfully. "There are more introductory verses to come," said the other professor, "but I'm hungry." He sat down, cut a large slice of cake, put it on Bruno's plate, and gazed at his own empty plate in astonishment. "Where did you get that cake?" Sylvie whispered to Bruno. "He gived it me," said Bruno. "But you shouldn't ask for things, you know you shouldn't." "I didn't ask," said Bruno, taking a fresh mouthful. "He gived it me." Sylvie considered this for a moment, then she saw her way out of it. "Well then, ask him to give me some." "You seem to enjoy that cake," the professor remarked. "Does that mean munch?" Bruno whispered to Sylvie. Sylvie nodded. "It means to munch and to like to munch." Bruno smiled at the professor. "I doos enjoy it," he said. The other professor caught the word. "And I hope you're enjoying yourself, little man?" he inquired. Bruno's look of horror quite startled him. "No, indeed I aren't," he said. The other professor looked thoroughly puzzled. "Well, well," he said, "try some cowslip wine." And he filled a glass and handed it to Bruno. "Drink this, my dear, and you'll be quite another man." "Who shall I be?" said Bruno, pausing in the act of putting it to his lips. "Don't ask so many questions," Sylvie interposed, anxious to save the poor old man from further bewilderment. "Suppose we get the professor to tell us a story?" Bruno adopted the idea with enthusiasm. "Please do!" he cried eagerly. "Something about tigers and bumblebees and robin redbreasts, who knows?"
"Why should you always have live things in stories?" said the professor. "Why don't you have events or circumstances?"
"Oh, please invent a story like that!" cried Bruno.
The professor began fluently enough. "Once a coincidence was taking a walk with a little accident, and they met an explanation. A very old explanation. So old that it was quite doubled up, and looked more like a conundrum." He broke off suddenly.
"Please go on!"
both children exclaimed. The professor made a candid confession. "It's a very difficult sort to invent, I find. Suppose Bruno tells one first." Bruno was only too happy to adopt the suggestion.
"Once there were a pig, and a accordion, and 2 jars of orange marmalade."
"The dramatis personae," murmured the professor. Well, what then?
So when the pig played on the accordion, Bruno went on, one of the jars of orange marmalade didn't like the tune, and the other jar of orange marmalade did like the tune. I know I shall get confused among those jars of orange marmalade, Sylvie, he whispered anxiously. I will now recite the other introductory verses, said the other professor. Little birds are choking baronets with bun, taught to fire a gun, taught, I say, to splinter salmon in the winter, merely for the fun. Little birds are hiding crimes in carpet bags, blessed by happy stags, blessed, I say, though beaten, since our friends are eaten when the memory flags. Little birds are tasting gratitude and gold, pale with sudden cold, pale, I say, and wrinkled, when the bells have tinkled, and the tale is told.
The next thing to be done, the professor cheerfully remarked to the Lord Chancellor, as soon as the applause caused by the recital of the pigtail had come to an end, is to drink the Emperor's health, is it not? Undoubtedly, the Lord Chancellor replied with much solemnity, as he rose to his feet to give the necessary directions for the ceremony. Fill your glasses, he thundered. All did so instantly. Drink the Emperor's health. A general gurgling resounded all through the hall. 3 cheers for the Emperor. The faintest possible sound followed this announcement, and the Chancellor, with admirable presence of mind, instantly proclaimed, "A speech from the Emperor." The Emperor had begun his speech almost before the words were uttered. However unwilling to be Emperor, since you all wish me to be Emperor, you know how badly the late Warden managed things. With such enthusiasm as you have shown, he persecuted you. He taxed you too heavily. You know who is fittest man to be Emperor. My brother had no sense. How long this curious speech might have lasted, it is impossible to say, for just at this moment a hurricane shook the palace to its foundations, bursting open the windows, extinguishing some of the lamps, and filling the air with clouds of dust, which took strange shapes in the air, and seemed to form words. But the storm subsided as suddenly as it had risen. The casements swung into their places again, the dust vanished, all was as it had been a minute ago, with the exception of the Emperor and Empress, over whom had come a wondrous change. The vacant stare, the meaningless smile, had passed away. All could see that these 2 strange beings had returned to their senses. The Emperor continued his speech as if there had been no interruption. And we have behaved, my wife and I, like 2 arrant knaves. We deserve no better name. When my brother went away, you lost the best warden you ever had. And I've been doing my best, wretched hypocrite that I am, to cheat you into making me an emperor. Me, one that has hardly got the wits to be a shoeblack. The Lord Chancellor wrung his hands in despair. He is mad, good people, he was beginning. But both speeches stopped suddenly, and in the dead silence that followed, a knocking was heard at the outer door. "What is it?" was the general cry. People began running in and out. The excitement increased every moment. The Lord Chancellor, forgetting all the rules of court ceremony, ran full speed down the hall, and in a minute returned, pale and gasping for breath. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Sylvie and Bruno Concluded by Lewis Carroll. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Catharine Eastman. Chapter 24. The Beggar's Return. Your Imperial Highnesses, he began, it's the old beggar again. Shall we set the dogs at him? "Bring him here," said the Emperor. The Chancellor could scarcely believe his ears. "Here, your Imperial Highness? Did I rightly understand?" "Bring him here," the Emperor thundered once more. The Chancellor tottered down the hall, and in another minute the crowd divided, and the poor old beggar was seen entering the banqueting hall. He was indeed a pitiable object. The rags that hung about him were all splashed with mud. His white hair and his long beard were tossed about in wild disorder. Yet he walked upright, with a stately tread, as if used to command. And, strangest sight of all, Sylvie and Bruno came with him, clinging to his hands, and gazing at him with looks of silent love. Men looked eagerly to see how the Emperor would receive the bold intruder. Would he hurl him from the steps of the dais? But no. To their utter astonishment, the Emperor knelt as the beggar approached, and with bowed head murmured, "Forgive us!" "Forgive us!" the Empress, kneeling at her husband's side, meekly repeated. The outcast smiled. "Rise up," he said. "I forgive you." And men saw with wonder that a change had passed over the old beggar, even as he spoke. What had seemed but now to be vile rags and splashes of mud were seen to be in truth kingly trappings, broidered with gold and sparkling with gems. All knew him now, and bent low before the elder brother, the true warden. "Brother mine and sister mine," the warden began, in a clear voice that was heard all through that vast hall, "I come not to disturb you. Rule on as Emperor, and rule wisely. For I am chosen King of Elfland. Tomorrow I return there, taking naught from hence, save only... His voice trembled, and with a look of ineffable tenderness, he laid his hands in silence on the heads of the two little ones who clung around him. But he recovered himself in a moment, and beckoned to the Emperor to resume his place at the table. The company seated themselves again, room being found for the Elfin King between his two children, and the Lord Chancellor rose once more to propose the next toast. "The next toast? The hero of the day? Why, he isn't here!" he broke off in wild confusion. Good gracious! Everybody had forgotten Prince Uggug. "He was told of the banquet, of course?" said the Emperor. "Undoubtedly," replied the Chancellor. "That would be the duty of the gold stick in waiting." "Let the gold stick come forwards," the Emperor gravely said. The gold stick came forwards. "I attended on his Imperial fatness," was the statement made by the trembling official. "I told him of the lecture and the banquet." "What followed?" said the Emperor, for the unhappy man seemed almost too frightened to go on. "His Imperial fatness was graciously pleased to be sulky. His Imperial fatness was graciously pleased to box my ears. His Imperial fatness was graciously pleased to say, 'I don't care.'" "Don't care" came to a bad end, Sylvie whispered to Bruno. "I'm not sure, but I believe he was hanged." The Professor overheard her. "That result," he blandly remarked, "was merely a case of mistaken identity." Both children looked puzzled. "Permit me to explain. Don't care and Care were twin brothers. Care, you know, killed the cat, and they caught Don't Care by mistake and hanged him instead, and so Care is alive still. But he's very unhappy without his brother. That's why they say, 'Begone, dull Care.'" "Thank you," Sylvie said heartily. "It's very extremely interesting. Why, it seems to explain everything." "Well, not quite everything," the Professor modestly rejoined. "There are 2 or 3 scientific difficulties." "What was your general impression as to his Imperial fatness?" the Emperor asked the gold stick. "My impression was that his Imperial fatness was getting more
More what?
All listened breathlessly for the next word.
More prickly. He must be sent for at once,
the Emperor exclaimed, and the gold stick went off like a shot. The Elfin King sadly shook his head. No use, no use, he murmured to himself. Loveless, loveless. Pale, trembling, speechless, the gold stick came slowly back again.
Well, said the Emperor, why does not the prince appear?
One can easily guess, said the Professor. His imperial fatness is, without doubt, a little preoccupied. Bruno turned a look of solemn enquiry on his old friend.
What do that word mean?
But the Professor took no notice of the question. He was eagerly listening to the gold stick's reply.
Please, your Highness, his imperial fatness is...
Not a word more could he utter. The Empress rose in an agony of alarm. "Let us go to him!" she cried, and there was a general rush for the door. Bruno slipped off his chair in a moment.
"May we go too?"
he eagerly asked. But the King did not hear the question, as the Professor was speaking to him. "Preoccupied, your Majesty," he was saying. "That is what he is, no doubt."
"May we go and see him?"
Bruno repeated. The King nodded assent, and the children ran off. In a minute or two they returned, slowly and gravely. "Well," said the King, "what's the matter with the Prince?"
"He's what you said,"
Bruno replied, looking at the Professor.
"That hard word."
And he looked to Sylvie for assistance.
"Porcupine," said Sylvie.
"No, no," the Professor corrected her. "Preoccupied, you mean." "No, it's porcupine," persisted Sylvie. "Not that other word at all. And please will you come? The house is all in an uproar."
"And oo'd better bring an uproar glass wizu," added Bruno.
We got up in great haste, and followed the children upstairs. No one took the least notice of me, but I wasn't at all surprised at this, as I had long realized that I was quite invisible to them all, even to Sylvie and Bruno. All along the gallery that led to the Prince's apartment, an excited crowd was surging to and fro, and the babble of voices was deafening. Against the door of the room 3 strong men were leaning, vainly trying to shut it, for some great animal inside was constantly bursting it half open, and we had a glimpse, before the men could push it back again, of the head of a furious wild beast, with great fiery eyes and gnashing teeth. Its voice was a sort of mixture. There was the roaring of a lion, and the bellowing of a bull, and now and then a scream like a gigantic parrot. "There is no judging by the voice," the Professor cried in great excitement. "What is it?" he shouted to the men at the door. And a general chorus of voices answered him, "Porcupine! Prince Uggug has turned into a porcupine!" "A new specimen!" exclaimed the delighted Professor. "Pray let me go in. It should be labelled at once." But the strong men only pushed him back. "Label it, indeed! Do you want to be eaten up?" they cried. "Never mind about specimens, Professor," said the Emperor, pushing his way through the crowd. "Tell us how to keep him safe." "A large cage," the Professor promptly replied. "Bring a large cage," he said to the people generally, "with strong bars of steel and a portcullis made to go up and down like a mousetrap. Does anyone happen to have such a thing about him?" It didn't sound a likely sort of thing for anyone to have about him. However, they brought him one directly. Curiously enough, there happened to be one standing in the gallery. "Put it facing the opening of the door, and draw up the portcullis." This was done in a moment. "Blankets now," cried the Professor. "This is a most interesting experiment." There happened to be a pile of blankets close by, and the Professor had hardly said the word when they were all unfolded and held up, like curtains, all around. The Professor rapidly arranged them in 2 rows, so as to make a dark passage leading straight from the door to the mouth of the cage. "Now fling the door open." This did not need to be done. The 3 men had only to leap out of the way, and the fearful monster flung the door open for itself, and, with a yell like the whistle of a steam engine, rushed into the cage. "Down with the portcullis!" No sooner said than done, and all breathed freely once more on seeing the Porcupine safely caged. The Professor rubbed his hands in childish delight. "The experiment has succeeded," he proclaimed. "All that is needed now is to feed it 3 times a day on chopped carrots and—" "Never mind about its food just now," the Emperor interrupted. "Let us return to the banquet. Brother, will you lead the way?" And the old man, attended by his children, headed the procession downstairs. "See the fate of a loveless life," he said to Bruno as they returned to their places. To which Bruno made reply, "I always loved Sylvie, so I'll never get prickly like that."
"He is prickly, certainly," said the Professor, who had caught the last words. "But we must remember that, however porcupiney, he is royal still. After this feast is over, I'm going to take a little present to Prince Uggug, just to soothe him, you know. It isn't pleasant living in a cage."
"What'll you give him for a birthday present?"
Bruno inquired.
"A small saucer of chopped carrots," replied the Professor. "In giving birthday presents, my motto is cheapness. I should think I save £40 a year by giving— Oh, what a twinge of pain!"
"What is it?" said Sylvie anxiously.
"My old enemy," groaned the Professor. "Lumbago, rheumatism, that sort of thing. I think I'll go and lie down a bit."
And he hobbled out of the saloon, watched by the pitying eyes of the 2 children. "He'll be better soon," the Elfin King said cheerily. "Brother," turning to the Emperor, "I have some business to arrange with you tonight. The Empress will take care of the children." And the 2 brothers went away together, arm in arm. The Empress found the children rather sad company. They could talk of nothing but "the dear Professor" and "what a pity he's so ill," till at last she made the welcome proposal, "Let's go and see him." The children eagerly grasped the hands she offered them, and we went off to the Professor's study, and found him lying on the sofa, covered up with blankets, and reading a little manuscript book.
"Notes on Volume 3,
he murmured, looking up at us. And there, on a table near him, lay the book he was seeking when first I saw him. "And how are you now, Professor?" the Empress asked, bending over the invalid. The Professor looked up and smiled feebly.
"As devoted to your Royal Highness as ever," he said in a weak voice. "All of me that is not lumbago is loyalty."
"A sweet sentiment!" the Empress exclaimed with tears in her eyes. "You seldom hear anything so beautiful as that, even in a Valentine." "We must take you to stay at the seaside," Sylvie said tenderly. "It'll do you ever so much good, and the sea's so grand."
"But a mountain's grander,"
said Bruno.
"What is there grand about the sea?" said the Professor. "Why, you could put it all into a teacup."
"Some of it," Sylvie corrected him.
"Well, you'd only want a certain number of teacups to hold it all. And then where's the grandeur? Then, as to a mountain, why, you could carry it all away in a wheelbarrow in a certain number of years."
"It wouldn't look grand, the bits of it in the wheelbarrow," Sylvie candidly admitted.
"But when oo put it together again,"
Bruno began.
"When you're older," said the Professor, "you'll know that you can't put mountains together again so easily. One lives and one learns, you know."
"But it needn't be the same one, need it?" said Bruno. "Won't it do if I live and if Sylvie learns?"
"I can't learn without living," said Sylvie.
"But I can live without learning," Bruno retorted. "Oo just try me."
"What I meant was,"
the Professor began, looking much puzzled,
"was that you don't know everything, you know."
"But I do know everything I know,"
persisted the little fellow.
"I know ever so many things, everything, 'cept the things I don't know, and Sylvie knows all the rest."
The Professor sighed and gave it up.
"Do you know what a boojum is?"
"I know," cried Bruno. "It's the thing what wrenches people out of their boots."
"He means bootjack," Sylvie explained in a whisper.
"You can't wrench people out of boots,"
the Professor mildly observed. Bruno laughed saucily.
"Oo can, though, unless they're welly tight in."
"Once upon a time, there was a boojum,"
the Professor began, but stopped suddenly.
"I forget the rest of the fable," he said. "And there was a lesson to be learned from it. I'm afraid I forget that too."
"I'll tell oo a fable,"
Bruno began in a great hurry.
"Once there were a locust, and a magpie, and a engine driver, and the lesson is to learn to get up early."
"It isn't a bit interesting," Sylvie said contemptuously. "You shouldn't put the lesson so soon."
"When did you invent that fable?" said the Professor. "Last week?"
"No," said Bruno. "A deal shorter ago than that. Guess again."
"I can't guess,"
said the Professor.
"How long ago?"
"Why, it isn't invented yet!"
Bruno exclaimed triumphantly.
"But I have invented a lovely one. Shall I say it?"
"If you've finished inventing it," said Sylvie, "and let the lesson be to try again."
"No,"
said Bruno with great decision.
"The lesson are not to try again. Once there were a lovely Chinaman what stood on the chimbley piece, and he stood, and he stood. And one day he tumbled it off, and he didn't hurt hisself one bit. Only he would try again, and the next time he tumbled it off, he hurted hisself welly much, and braked off ever so much varnish."
"But how did he come back on the chimney-piece after his first tumble?" said the Empress. It was the first sensible question she had asked in all her life.
"I put him there!"
cried Bruno.
"Then I'm afraid you know something about his tumbling," said the Professor. "Perhaps you pushed him?"
To which Bruno replied very seriously,
"Didn't pushed him much. He were a lovely Chinaman,"
he added hastily, evidently very anxious to change the subject. "Come, my children," said the Elfin King, who had just entered the room. "We must have a little chat together before you go to bed." And he was leading them away, but at the door they let go his hands, and ran back again to wish the Professor good night.
"Good night, Professor, good night."
And Bruno solemnly shook hands with the old man, who gazed at him with a loving smile, while Sylvie bent down to press her sweet lips upon his forehead.
"Good night, little ones," said the Professor. "You may leave me now, to ruminate. I'm as jolly as the day is long, except when it's necessary to ruminate on some very difficult subject. All of me," he murmured sleepily as we left the room, "all of me that isn't bonhomie is rumination."
"What did he say, Bruno?" Sylvie inquired, as soon as we were safely out of hearing.
"I think he said, all of me that isn't bone disease is rheumatism. Whatever are that knocking, Sylvie?"
Sylvie stopped and listened anxiously. It sounded like someone kicking at a door. "I hope it isn't that porcupine breaking loose!" she exclaimed.
"Let's go on," Bruno said hastily. "There's nothing to wait for, Bruno."
End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Sylvie and Bruno Concluded by Lewis Carroll. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Catharine Eastman. Chapter 25. Life out of Death. The sound of kicking, or knocking, grew louder every moment, and at last a door opened somewhere near us. "Did you say 'come in,' sir?" my landlady asked timidly. "Oh, yes, come in," I replied. "What's the matter?" "A note has just been left for you, sir, by the baker's boy. He said he was passing the hall, and they asked him to come round and leave it here." The note contained 5 words only. "Please come at once. Muriel." A sudden terror seemed to chill my very heart. "The Earl is ill," I said to myself. "Dying, perhaps." And I hastily prepared to leave the house. "No bad news, sir, I hope?" my landlady said as she saw me out. "The boy said someone had arrived unexpectedly." "I hope that is it," I said. But my feelings were those of fear rather than of hope, though on entering the house I was somewhat reassured by finding luggage lying in the entrance, bearing the initials E.L. "It's only Eric Lindon, after all," I thought, half relieved and half annoyed. Surely she need not have sent me for that. Lady Muriel met me in the passage. Her eyes were gleaming, but it was the excitement of joy rather than of grief. "I have a surprise for you," she whispered. "You mean that Eric Lindon is here?" I said, vainly trying to disguise the involuntary bitterness of my tone. "The funeral baked meats did coldly furnish forth the marriage tables," I could not help repeating to myself. How cruelly I was misjudging her. "No, no," she eagerly replied. "At least, Eric is here, but..." Her voice quivered. "But there is another..." No need for further question. I eagerly followed her in. There on the bed he lay, pale and worn, the mere shadow of his old self, my old friend, come back again from the dead. "Arthur!" I exclaimed. I could not say another word. "Yes, back again, old boy," he murmured, smiling as I grasped his hand. "He," indicating Eric, who stood near, "saved my life. He brought me back. Next to God, we must thank him, Muriel, my wife." Silently I shook hands with Eric and with the Earl, and with one consent we moved into the shaded side of the room, where we could talk without disturbing the invalid, who lay, silent and happy, holding his wife's hand in his, and watching her with eyes that shone with a deep, steady light of love. "He has been delirious till today," Eric explained in a low voice. "And even today he has been wandering more than once. But the sight of her has been new life to him." And then he went on to tell us, in would-be careless tones, I knew how he hated any display of feeling, How he had insisted on going back to the plague-stricken town, to bring away a man whom the doctor had abandoned as dying, but who might, he fancied, recover if brought to the hospital. How he had seen nothing in the wasted features to remind him of Arthur, and only recognized him when he visited the hospital a month after. How the doctor had forbidden him to announce the discovery, saying that any shock to the overtaxed brain might kill him at once. How he had stayed on at the hospital, and nursed the sick man by night and day. All this with the studied indifference of one who is relating the commonplace acts of some chance acquaintance. And this was his rival, I thought. The man who had won from him the heart of the woman he loved. "The sun is setting," said Lady Muriel, rising and leading the way to the open window. "Just look at the western sky. What lovely crimson tints. We shall have a glorious day tomorrow." We had followed her across the room, and were standing in a little group, talking in low tones in the gathering gloom, when we were startled by the voice of the sick man, murmuring words too indistinct for the ear to catch. "He is wandering again," Lady Muriel whispered, and returned to the bedside. We drew a little nearer also, but no, this had none of the incoherence of delirium. "What reward shall I give unto the Lord?" the tremulous lips were saying. "For all the benefits that he hath done unto me, I will receive the cup of salvation, and call... But here the poor weakened memory failed, and the feeble voice died into silence. His wife knelt down at the bedside, raised one of his arms, and drew it across her own, fondly kissing the thin white hand that lay so listlessly in her loving grasp. It seemed to me a good opportunity for stealing away without making her go through any form of parting, so, nodding to the Earl and Eric, I silently left the room. Eric followed me down the stairs and out into the night. "Is it life or death?" I asked him, as soon as we were far enough from the house for me to speak in ordinary tones. "It is life," he replied with eager emphasis. "The doctors are quite agreed as to that. All he needs now, they say, is rest and perfect quiet and good nursing. He's quite sure to get rest and quiet here. And as for the nursing, why, I think it's just possible." He tried hard to make his trembling voice assume a playful tone. "He may even get fairly well nursed in his present quarters." "I'm sure of it," I said. "Thank you so much for coming out to tell me." And, thinking he had now said all he had come to say, I held out my hand to bid him good night. He grasped it warmly, and added, turning his face away as he spoke, "By the way, there is one other thing I wanted to say. I thought you'd like to know that I'm not in the mind I was in when last we met. It isn't that I can accept Christian belief, at least not yet. But all this came about so strangely, and she had prayed, you know, and I had prayed, and... His voice broke, and I could only just catch the concluding words. "There is a God that answers prayer. I know it for certain now." He wrung my hand once more, and left me suddenly. Never before had I seen him so deeply moved. So, in the gathering twilight, I paced slowly homewards, in a tumultuous whirl of happy thoughts. My heart seemed full and running over with joy and thankfulness. All that I had so fervently longed for and prayed for seemed now to have come to pass. And though I reproached myself bitterly for the unworthy suspicion I had for one moment harboured against the true-hearted Lady Muriel, I took comfort in knowing it had been but a passing thought. Not Bruno himself could have mounted the stairs with so buoyant a step, as I felt my way up in the dark, not pausing to strike a light in the entry, as I knew I had left the lamp burning in my sitting-room. But it was no common lamplight into which I now stepped, with a strange, new, dreamy sensation of some subtle witchery that had come over the place. Light, richer and more golden than any lamp could give, flooded the room, streaming in from a window I had somehow never noticed before, and lighting up a group of 3 shadowy figures that grew momently more distinct. A grave old man in royal robes, leaning back in an easy-chair, and 2 children, a girl and a boy, standing at his side. "Have you the jewel still, my child?" the old man was saying. "Oh, yes!" Sylvie exclaimed with unusual eagerness. "Do you think I'd ever lose it or forget it?" She undid the ribbon round her neck as she spoke, and laid the jewel in her father's hand. Bruno looked at it admiringly.
"What a lovely brightness!" he said. "It's just like a little red star. May I take it in my hand?"
Sylvie nodded, and Bruno carried it off to the window and held it aloft against the sky, whose deepening blue was already spangled with stars. Soon he came running back, in some excitement.
"Sylvie, look here!" he cried. "I can see right through it when I hold it up to the sky, and it isn't red a bit. It's, oh, such a lovely blue, and the words are all different. Do look at it."
Sylvie was quite excited too, by this time, and the 2 children eagerly held up the jewel to the light, and spelled out the legend between them. "All will love Sylvie."
"Why, this is the other jewel!" cried Bruno. "Don't you remember, Sylvie? The one you didn't choose."
Sylvie took it from him with a puzzled look, and held it up, now up to the light, now down. "It's blue one way," she said softly to herself, "and it's red the other way. Why, I thought there were 2 of them. Father!" she suddenly exclaimed, laying the jewel once more in his hand. "I do believe it was the same jewel all the time."
"Then you choosed it from itself," Bruno thoughtfully remarked. "Father, could Sylvie choose a thing from itself?"
"Yes, my own one," the old man replied to Sylvie, not noticing Bruno's embarrassing question. "It was the same jewel, but you chose quite right." And he fastened the ribbon round her neck again.
"Sylvie will love all. All will love Sylvie,"
Bruno murmured, raising himself on tiptoe to kiss the little red star.
"And when you look at it, it's red and fierce like the sun, and when you look through it, it's gentle and blue like the sky."
"God's own sky," Sylvie said dreamily.
"God's own sky,"
the little fellow repeated, as they stood lovingly clinging together and looking out into the night.
"But, oh, Sylvie, what makes the sky such a darling blue?"
Sylvie's sweet lips shaped themselves to reply, but her voice sounded faint and very far away. The vision was fast slipping from my eager gaze, but it seemed to me, in that last bewildering moment, that not Sylvie, but an angel, was looking out through those trustful brown eyes, and that not Sylvie's, but an angel's voice was whispering, "It is love." End of chapter 25, and end of Sylvie and Bruno Concluded, by Lewis Carroll. Thank you for listening.